So moving in, what we'd like to talk about a little bit today is just some highlights of what is required of you as operators, and get into some of the areas. Now, we could sit here and talk all day about drug and alcohol. Part 40 and 199's got a lot of stuff that's in there, but we kind of highlighted some of the key areas, the functional areas, if you will, from the regulation. Get into some challenges, and then some Q&A along the way, if you will. And there's a couple of NPRMs, some changes that just occurred and some that are about to occur later on this year. Before we even jump into the regulation part, why do we even need regulations? Anybody ask that? Answer that? Why do we need a drug and alcohol regulation? Safety? Do we always make the right decisions even when we're sober? No, right? Arguably, sometimes we make wrong decisions even when we are sober, right? I love this next one right here. I actually showed this to somebody that works as a fire chief over in Abilene, Texas, where I live. And I said, what is up with this? And he goes, well, Dennis, I mean, duh. If you sever the line, something drives over it, like a rail car, you sever the line, you can't fight the fire. So I don't know if they have another crew standing by for the derailment, but yeah. Always love these safety pictures. Anybody in here work on rectifiers? So if you have a problem with shunts blowing out or anything like that, this is a fix, apparently. And then I love this area that they chose to have this venue because they got this nice little area. I don't know if we could swim back there, but if you do have a problem swimming, you can always do what these individuals did. Save a little bit of money and clean up the environment a little bit while we're at it. That does happen. We're building something around our house, and my wife goes, well, we don't have a seahorse or whatever you call those things. I was like, it's not a seahorse. She goes, well, can you just bend down and I'll cut it? So I think she's seen my pictures here. What happens when we add a little bit of intoxication to that? These go above and beyond. So arguably there is a problem. Roughly, some of these stats that you're going to see, I'm going to breeze through these as quick as I possibly can. Stats are just exactly what they are. They're stats and a bunch of numbers and everything like that. Right here is roughly about 140 million people in the United States taken at this time consume alcohol. That's 52% of our population. And again, this was taken, I believe, back in 2014. Out of that, what's interesting is the amount of people that are employed versus the amount of people that are unemployed. Now, one can argue that while they have a job, they can afford to, purchase the alcohol to be able to engage in a little bit of drinking. I've had one person say, well, that's because their job drives me to drink. So recognizing that and the drug use. This is a pretty big one right here. It kind of got my eyes when I first looked at this. 68.9% of those using illicit drugs, this is not just the craze of marijuana right now, were actually employed. And where that comes into our industry, this is the HHS lab, which is the certified labs that you're allowed to utilize for your drug and alcohol program. In 2014, I believe it was between July and December, about 3 million tests were conducted. This is not the whole year that they took this number from. And 57,000 of those were confirmed positive. Well, let me back that up. Not confirmed by the MRO, but the lab confirmed them as positive. They still had to go through the MRO. When you look at the total number and the fact that you only tested 25%, you can almost multiply that by 4. PHMSA had posted that, well, it only raised 1.75 to 1.79. And also FMCSA uses the same stats too, which is probably the reason why we've seen FMCSA, your federal motor carrier, go from 50% to 25%. And then just a quick slide right here. I got this from the government's website where they actually break it down as far as what drugs are actually being used. And believe it or not, heroin is on the rise. A lot of that is from prescription drugs is what they briefed. And marijuana, as you see that, it's pretty much stayed the same. Roughly 47,000 of those positive tests a year are confirmed with marijuana. So, why we need a drug and alcohol program? There is a problem, there will always continue to be a problem. We cannot fix everything, but what we can do is have something in place to mitigate that, and that's the whole purpose of this part of the regulation, to mitigate and provide for a safe environment. And the reason why they have that regulation. And the two regulations that cover that is Part 40, 49 CFR Part 40, as well as 199. Now that said, remember I asked the question and everybody rose their hand. Here's where you get to start asking some questions. Going over what is required of you of operators. And before we get into each one of these little sections that we're going to get into, I just want to add a caveat. There is a whole lot of stuff within 199 and Part 40. You're required to have everything in there, 199 and Part 40, not just the key things that we're going to talk about today. As well as if you were to go to the government's website, you can pull this nice little checklist that they have. I believe it's 20 pages or something like that, comprehensive checklist. Those aren't the only things that you're required to have. Those are basically guidelines for the inspectors to be able to go look. A good inspector, in my personal opinion, will look at that question and start peeling the onion back a couple steps up and a couple steps below each one of those questions. Okay? So what it says in the regulation is each operator is required to have your program and maintain that written program, as well as programs for your employees. You can have by contract that you can let your contractors and their subs and subs and subs, as it goes on down the list, have their own written program, but you have to have some sort of oversight of those programs. And we're going to talk, Lauren and I will talk a little bit about that, and she'll give some examples too as far as what Con Edison is doing or has already done to answer some of those. The scope of the requirement of this is any owner-operator that operates underneath the requirements of 192, 193, and of course 195 are required to test their covered employees. And we're also going to talk a lot about the term covered here shortly. So I promise we're going to just break down a little bit of it. The key areas are the testing. This is like the core of the program, that everything's kind of written around to ensure that this is actually happening. And of those, there's roughly 6 different types of tests. The first one that we're going to go over is the pre-employment, and there's 2 components to that pre-employment. The first part of that is the investigation piece, also known as the background. This is where I see a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of difficulty, especially when it comes to internal employees.
Yeah, actually, I was going to add that, so just so I clarify, I got involved with the drug and alcohol program kind of similar to around the time I got involved with the alcohol program after a number of incidents led us to take a closer look at the program, and we made a lot of enhancements to our program since then. One of the gaps we found was not necessarily our processes around an external employee coming in to Con Edison for the first time, because we had a lot of security around how the checks and balances. But what we found is when you have an internal employee that is maybe a gas operations employee that doesn't perform a covered function, accepting a job or being transferred into an area where now all of a sudden they're going to perform a covered function. HR organizations weren't exactly flagging that transfer as prior to entering that new job, which would really put them in a covered function role for the first time as needing that pre-employment. So we've added some enhancements around policies and procedures of prior to that transfer, catching those individuals and putting them through the pre-employment investigation that we would an external hire.
Good. Any questions? I thought I seen a hand, or am I just, Yep, all right. So thanks, Lauren. The background checks are pretty important, and we do some assessments for other operators out in the United States, and we do find that this is one of the areas where there's a lot of confusion, because a lot of times those that manage your program don't necessarily work within the compliance section. And a lot of times we find that HR manage that program, and a lot of times those hands don't shake. Their HR is dealing with all kinds of different regulations, as is you all are. But the two kind of need to shake hands, especially when you're moving people around, like you said.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened in this case as well. And we're putting in some checkpoints between myself, my groups, and HR so that we kind of make sure that we're all working together.
Okay. I do have a question for you too, Lauren, that might be able to, on the pre-employment requirement for the drug testing piece of it, not just the background piece. One of the things that I've seen on a couple of projects that I was on, large projects, I should say, where the operators got these contractors coming through and they're hiring a bunch of day laborers. and they've got kind of like a assembly line, if you will, and they're testing people, they're giving them their OSHA training, their PPE, whole 9 yards, and then that afternoon they're out working.
Oh, okay.
Under the pre-employment piece of it, the requirement is you have to be not only part of a covered pool listing, but you have to have that negative back.
Right.
So by virtue of just having somebody submit a sample, doesn't mean that they can go out and work.
Right, exactly. We try to line up our pre-employment screening, a number of days to weeks prior to the start date of that employee so that you get that negative result back prior to the start date. It's easy to do when it's our own employees, a little more harder to manage when you're talking about contractors, where we as the LDC don't really know the start dates, but it's more about, and we're going to get into this a little later about how we're auditing and managing our contractor workforce when it comes to this, and what our expectations for them to manage the programs appropriately.
Good, thank you. All right. The next part of the requirement for drug testing is, of course, the randoms. Randoms is what it is. It says you will random test your employees reasonably throughout the year. What they're not asking or wanting an operator to do, or your contractors, is, oh my gosh, it's November and I haven't tested anybody. Let's just get everybody now. Or we got a lot going on this year. Let's test everybody in January at 30% and we're covered, right? That is not the case, and one of the things that, or the expectations of the government, or the program, I should say, that is one of the things that we have found from looking at what we do at Veriforce that occasionally is a potential problem.
Well, one thing we found is because we have shifts, we have people working all different hours, including weekends. Historically speaking, our randoms had been scheduled during the 7 to 3:30 operations. So you were only getting the employees working that shift and not every employee in the pool. So now we randomly select throughout the day, including weekends. And so obviously you're getting more, it's a little bit more difficult to manage because I, as a 7 to 3:30 employee, might be called on a Saturday and the response is I'm not working today. So we're getting a little extra of the no, that person's not available, but we are at least saying we're covering all shifts, and we are catching the individuals who only work the night shift that are part of the pool, that they truly are really randomly being selected.
Good. The next testing is the post-accident. Now, there's been some changes to this. Federal Register Volume 82, number 13, I believe, in January 2017, they posted this out, and it's since been published as rule. I've gotten a lot of questions from several operators on this of, well, it's been posted, but I went to PHMSA's website and it's not on their checklist. Does not have to be in their checklist. They can audit you on anything. This is now final rule. Just because it's not in the checklist doesn't mean that it's not mandated or required. One of those for the post-accident, there's quite a bit for, it addressed post-accident and post-alcohol, correct? Right. And it also addressed what you need to do as far as documentation is concerned. But what it basically, in a sense, did is it took away, I don't want to say, probably the wrong word to say, operators' ability to make that decision, but it kind of did. It basically says...
The last line there, if you cannot completely discount someone's work from contributing to that accident, they should be tested. Well, within, as we all, Carly can share stories, when an incident or an accident just happened and you're deciding, who do I have to test? At that point in time, you don't know the full story, so how can you completely discount anyone at that point? So the default, and they're basically expressing that the default should be test everyone involved. Yeah. And if you didn't, which I think we get to next, is document reasons why.
Yes. And good point that you mentioned that. I mean, because when you read the language in there, they're not telling you you have to, but they kind of are.
Right.
It'd be really hard to pass a red-face test, when we get into this section right here with the post-accident with alcohol. It requires that you have to do it within a couple hours.
Right.
Whereas the drug, I believe, is 32 hours. And like Lauren was saying, if you do not document that, if you don't administer the test within 32 hours of drugs or 2 hours of alcohol, you now have to document it and store those documents or maintain those documents for a period, I believe, of 8 years, or 3 years, I'm sorry, 3 years.
Right, and what we've seen is more for documenting a reason for not testing. It might be a latent incident where you don't identify the incident until that 2-hour period is up. So you're really only documenting the fact that the incident was discovered after the time period, and therefore that was the reason why you couldn't test for alcohol and only did the drug test at that point. Right. So that's what we have documented in the more recent incidents.
Good. To also add to that, too, what we see a lot is a lot of accident reporting in our system, and what that is all contractors mainly not understanding the definitions of what an incident or an accident actually is. And, you know, to basically no fault of their own, they've got all these other documents and regulations and their own internal policies. Most companies do have their own internal policies where it says, if you get a hangnail, you need to go and test for alcohol, right? Or you tripped and busted your head open, or whatever the company policy may be. So they're actually reacting very well in the field and requesting those. But as an operator, you need to monitor your contractors to make sure you're not making reports of those when you don't need to make reports of those that don't fall underneath that definition. The next part is one of my favorite parts, because it touches training too as well, is reasonable cause and reasonable suspicion. Why they changed the wording on it, one for drug and one for alcohol. They basically mean the same thing. But to even get to that point for reasonable cause and reasonable suspicion that allows you to be able to make that test, there's key things that need to occur, which is training. How do you guys at Coniston answer that?
So the regulation requires those supervising individuals performing covered functions to also be trained in reasonable suspicion. What we do is there's some videos that PHMSA has approved for use. So we have instructor-led video training. Our environmental health and safety department are our trainers in this regard. 2 hours for drugs, 2 hours for alcohol, and it goes over kind of scenarios and what is appropriate to observe, and then send someone for a test. What we've taken it a step further is who is required to take this training. At Con Edison, we've identified not just the supervisors, but many different management type organizations should take this training, predominantly because of incident response. If an incident occurred, we have our quality assurance and quality control groups, as well as our environmental and health and safety groups, sometimes ending up responding to those incidents prior to the supervision. And because you're the first management employee on site able to perform reasonable suspicion observations, we want those individuals to have the training so they can make a call. They're there observing the mechanic or the technician for the first time, and if you see something's not right, you can make that call and send them within the right time frame.
Good, thanks for that input. One of the questions, whether you manage your drug and alcohol program or have any stake in it for your company, one of the things that I would recommend looking at within your company, especially you've got 1,000 moving parts and equal amount of people doing work for you, do you have personnel trained in those remote areas that can make that reasonable cause, reasonable suspicion determination? In fact, at the end of the slide, I'll show you a fine, I believe it was in the 40s of thousands of dollars that an operator got fined because they did not have somebody there to make that determination. So good point, thanks for bringing that. Return to duty. So I see a lot of policies and they say, well, we don't return anybody to duty. We've got zero tolerance policy, which is fine, and you can do that. You do have to identify that as you're taking that action as a company, and that's not the stance of the government. However, one of the key things in there is for the return to duty. If you do not allow return to duty, you still have to follow the process of making documentation that you provided an SAP to the employee or ex-employee as you were escorting them off of your property. Okay? And underneath these parts of the code, there's certain requirements that you have to meet in order to return the employee to duty. They have to have a come up clean on a drug test. And then they also have to follow the follow-up testing too as well, where the SAP will monitor up to 60 or up to the maximum of 60 months, and the SAP can make a recommendation to go ahead and wipe their slate clean and say they're good to go. But as soon as they do that return to duty test, you can't allow them to continue to work for you in a covered function. Okay. So what do we test for? Here's another area that I see some potential concerns in a lot of plans. I see a lot of companies will take their internal policy, their drug-free workplace program, and kind of marry it together with your DOT program. There's nothing that really says you cannot do that, but there's a lot of we don't recommend you do this. If you do add to the 5-panel test that's required, you have to take that stance as a company and specifically write it in your plan and identify that this is just your company requirements, and you will not hold that employee accountable for covered function as far as what's required under 199 or Part 40. You guys, I believe, keep your plans separate? Or?
We keep our plans separate, yeah. We have a lot of different drug and alcohol testing pools and plans, so
Wow.
yeah, it's just easier to keep them separate.
Right. And that would definitely be my recommendation, is to keep those separate. Circling back around as far as the responsibilities. So everything, what we talked about, and then everything else that's in that regulation under Part 40 and 199 within CFR, you're required for, to answer to, rather. What the government doesn't really want to see, and the intent is not to copy the regulation and then put, this is our drug and alcohol program. They want to see what is it that you're doing to answer each one of those requirements. The other thing is what are you doing to ensure that your service agents and consortiums or third-party agencies that you're utilizing are meeting your contractual obligations that you have with them, and as well as the requirements. I like that saying, you can contract out your work, but you can't contract out your regulatory obligation. Within 199 and Part 40, you can contract out 99% of everything with the exception of one thing, and that is your company DER. And that individual or individuals are responsible for basically assuring that everybody you contracted out is following or meeting those requirements.
And that's why auditing, if you are contracting a majority of this out, doing checks and balances like quality assurance type audits is very important. So you can catch areas of improvement with these vendors.
Good. Yes, sir.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about how you do ensure that what you've contracted out, that they are doing it? You mentioned auditing. I mean, do you have third parties go in and audit, or do you get attestations, or, I mean, how do you know that the off-site drug testing is being done in accordance with the requirements and that sort of thing?
So some of the audits we've done records audits in terms of the paperwork coming out of this. So we contract out the actual testing, the random testings. We have mobile vans, and that company kind of goes around and does the random testing. So we've done records audits and we've done field audits. We know where they are on any given day, so we may pop in and do field observations of them actually performing the tests and filling out the paperwork, but we also do after the fact records audits, similar to the way PHMSA or the Public Service Commission would, checking that all of the paperwork was filled out correctly. Speaking of having companies, multiple programs, one of the gaps we found with this third-party vendor was that they were not necessarily in the past filling out the paperwork correctly. If someone was being sent for a DOT pipeline test, we found some paperwork being filled out for the corporate pool. So we found those mistakes and we're correcting them. So those are the types of things we've been looking for. Now we're going to get to a little later. Oh, here it is, contractor compliance. Contractor workforce compliance with drug and alcohol programs is different than your third-party vendors, that you contract out the program to. But it's equally important because you're ultimately responsible for those contractors that are performing covered functions. So some of the audits we've done are we review their plans and make assessments against their plans, and we do that pretty regularly. But also on top of that, we're checking the workforce. Are the individual contractors out there working for us in the contractor pools? And we'll go as far as to stop a job if we don't have an updated pool that doesn't have that contractor employee on their list. And oftentimes it's that they haven't sent us the most updated list like they're supposed to. But we'll stop jobs, we'll issue action lines, we'll have corrective actions coming out of the contractors themselves because of deficiencies we found when we're doing these quality checks on our contractors.
Answer your question, sir? Any more questions? Good. Leading into, you were talking about performing covered functions for you. This is a pretty hot topic as far as where I see a lot of confusion. Yeah. Okay, what do they mean by employees and functions? What is a covered function? First, we'll talk a little bit about the employee. An employee or individual that performs a covered function for you. So that's anybody. When you look at that employee, that's also your contractors, subcontractors, anybody that sub may hire. If they're working on your facility, performing a covered function, they're required underneath 199. And they have to be tested just like as a regular employee. Even if they are only doing a job for 1 day for you, they still have to be part of that pool. The part that where I see a lot of confusion is this next section right here where it talks about what is a covered function. I see some programs where they'll say, well, anything that's an OQ covered task, that's covered function, nobody else needs to be on there. Not necessarily the case, is it?
Right, and it's definitely not the case when you have redefined your covered task definition. So at Con Edison, as I explained, our covered task is over-encompassing because it involves new construction tasks, and it doesn't cover emergency response. So you can't just take a one-for-one match. Anyone who's OQ'd is in the pool because that may be too large, and it also may not include everyone that it needs to be. The other thing you can't do that I've seen in the past and I've heard is, well, everyone in gas operations must perform a covered function, so everyone in the entire department or organization is going to be in the pool. You can't do that because that's considered flooding the pool with administrative and clerical people who really don't actually perform covered functions. One thing we did, which was extremely helpful, is we worked with our law department, who we have an SME in the law department on the legal side of things for interpreting this section of the regulation, and we came up with a kind of an 8-page document guideline on what is a covered function, examples of type of work that falls into covered functions, and the type of departments that perform that work. So we use that guideline every single time we create a new employee class or create a new organization. We go through the covered function rule to determine whether or not that group of individuals should or shouldn't be in the pool.
Good. One thing I'd like to add to that is Lauren talked about you can't add everybody. You also got to make sure you are adding the applicable people. Underneath 615 of the code for emergency plan, I just got done doing an audit for a company, or assessment rather, for a company looking at their program, and I looked at their emergency plan to determine who, what, when, where, and how are supposed to be part of the plan. And what they did to their plan is they put every employee of their company as part of the emergency plan. So they thought initially that every single one of those employees that are in there need to be part of the drug and alcohol pool. Not necessarily the case. They had employees in the plan that said, well, these employees at this group right here are going to call and set up all the hotels. That would not necessarily be a covered function. And then on the flip side of it, I looked at another program where they put basically the COO of the company. They had his name in there as far as because he lived pretty close to a valve site area, that he goes, well, I could just drive by there and shut the valve in. Didn't have covered tasks. That's a totally different section that Robert will talk about maybe a little bit later. But what they just did is they required the COO to be part of the drug and alcohol program, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but probably didn't really want to be part of the drug and alcohol program, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So good. Any questions on covered functions, covered employees? Okay. So what are some of these challenges? The biggest challenge that I've seen is the work that you contract out, from your CTPAs to your contractors. The contractor one could potentially be difficult if you don't have a team of people actually monitoring that. The expectation is, like you're doing the annual reviews of your drug and alcohol program, are you reviewing line by line the codes of your contractors? Do you have somebody doing that? I can tell you, personally, we reviewed, I won't throw the state out there, California, but they had a lot of, when the medical marijuana came about, because these are, again, managed in HR, they thought, oh, we can't take away their medical rights. So they took all of their drug and alcohol programs, and this wasn't everybody in California, by the way, but it was quite a bit of contractors that I had seen, they put, if you're on medical marijuana, you're exempt from this code. So by virtue of somebody having a plan and showing it to you, saying, we're good, here's our plan, and here's our covered pool, yeah, at a 10,000 foot view, you know they're in there, but did they have anything written in there that could go against the code? So you have to have somebody that's actually reviewing the contractor compliance. Hasn't been much move or change to the regulation in a while. There's a new sheriff in town, I can't remember his name. Stan Castanis is no longer with us. He kind of abruptly left. And I think Byron was in there for a little bit. I think if you submitted your drug and alcohol statistics, you got a nice little letter from Stan Castanis saying thank you. It was actually an email. Wayne Lemoy. Wayne Lemoy is the new, thanks, I always forget his name. New sheriff in town. So there might be some changes to the type of audits that are being performed. But the contractor compliance piece is huge. The other part that I've seen is the state laws. Medical marijuana, and then of course recreational use. Why are these a problem? We'll get into that a little bit here. I don't know why I've got these like this, I apologize. To answer some of these issues is need to review those programs, not only yourselves, your own internal programs, but your contractors. And if you're using a third-party company to do the audits of your contractors and manage that to report to you, and elect to have field-based type of audits, go out with them during the audits.
Right.
Do that show of force kind of thing. Trust but verify all of your contractors, regardless who it is. And as well as the collection sites, the government put out a nice little letter memo last year that said, what are you doing to monitor your collection sites? Con Edison sounds like you guys have a really good program, know where all your collection sites are. But do you know what your contractors are doing? Kind of thing.
Right. And I know for us, some of our contractors span across multiple states. So it's not as easy for our own internal employees who are only based in New York City and Westchester County to get out there to the sites that are further away, that are for the contractor sites. But we're working on maybe contracting that piece out to like a quality assurance type firm in those areas to do those checks for us.
Good. Your statistical data, monitoring statistical data of your contractors. Also, again, part of the whole program, but there's a nice little FAQ if you dig really, really deep in PHMSA's website, and says if you are basically just requiring statistical data from your contractors on a semi-annual basis, it's not enough. Now, will an auditor come down and ask that question? How often? That's a hit or a miss. Kind of like winning the lotto for $2 million that I asked if everybody wanted to win at the beginning, right? But when will that question be asked? Typically, when it's too late.
Right, I was going to say, if you're waiting till the end of the year, it's too late. If you get the statistical sampling from your contractors at the end of the year and it shows they didn't test 25%, it's too late. Now you and that contractor are out of compliance for that year.
Right. Looks like I'm going to blame it on the lawyer ahead of me that messed this. Where's he at? All right. So again, how do you assure your contractors that do not meet compliance or not performing covered functions? You said that you require them to submit you a new covered employee list and stuff like that.
Yeah, so we asked them for baseline, like let's say it's a new contractor, so they give us a baseline of who they've got in their pool right now, and then we ask them to submit anytime any changes occur, at a minimum, submit quarterly to us. Those are the lists we use when we go out and audit. So it behooves the contractors to get us the most updated list. So that's kind of, that auditing piece at the end is really kind of pushing them along to get us the list, because in the past we weren't policing it as much, so we were asking, and we got some operational drift where it went from once a quarter to once a year, and so now with the auditing piece, it really is driving that requirement home.
Awesome. One of the things I would highly recommend to look at too, for those of you, especially if you're out in the field, there's a lot of programs that are out there. You may have one internally that monitor at some sort of level your contractor compliance, and it'll have like a nice little light that'll glow up and say, they're meeting your safety, they're meeting this, they're meeting that. But when it comes down to the field, you can have basically a company that is meeting a percentage, but have an employee that not be added to the pool. And one of the other areas that we found when the last assessment that I went on was not necessarily those people that do have covered tasks, because those are usually checked by an inspector or an internal employee at the job site. But where I see a lot of it is missed is those that are working under span of control. Just because they are not qualified on a task, they are still performing a covered function. So when you're looking at the covered employee pools out there and validating that in the field before you allow them to work, you also need to check your those employees that are also working under span of control.
And if you happen to have LNG facilities, OpQual doesn't cover the individuals working at the LNG facilities, but those are certainly covered functions that need to be accounted for, LNG employees as well as contractors.
Yeah, good. The last challenge in this part that I see quite a bit is your or your contractor's DER employed? A lot of times what I have seen through doing assessments out in the field or even talking to our group that does the contractor assessments, it's usually somebody that's either sitting in HR and this is an additional duty for them, and they're like, okay, oh, here, manage this. Oh, okay, but they don't realize that there's some potential fines that are associated with it and a lot of moving parts that come to that. So you can have the best program written all day long, but if you don't have somebody that provides a little bit of oversight or some consulting to your internal employees, hence the DER, you're really kind of running a laissez-faire type of program potentially. I mentioned earlier the state law piece. A couple of reasons why that is important. So here is the current picture as of April 17th, or the 29th of this year, of the states that have some sort of legalization and or tolerance for marijuana in their state. Most of them are medical use. However, if you go around some of these states, medical use could be you're just not feeling too good today and you need something to help you focus, right? And they give you a prescription. The other one that's even more so a medical, in my personal opinion, is the 8 states plus Washington, D.C. that has basically legalized it for recreational use. Now, we didn't put this picture up here so you can plan your next vacation. But what this does, what this kind of tells you is, you know, is there a problem? Will there continue? There's always been a problem, folks. But in specific with marijuana use, no matter what side you take, with alcohol is actually worse than this, or, you know, it's a moot point because it's a regulation and it's a federal requirement. But when you look at this, of the states that are circumventing the federal law, as well as for both medical as well as this, what that can tell you is it's desensitizing a lot of people. I've been to Colorado, was up in California just the other week, and you can walk down the street and smell it. They've got these things, they call them vipers or vapors or whatever they call them. They're smoking that. So it's becoming more and more acceptable. When something becomes more and more acceptable, more and more people will do it. They'll go on vacation. But in this industry, you can't do that. In the future, I imagine it's going to be even more challenging. And then I believe Massachusetts was just added. So they're having fun.
Is that why
over
you
at UMass.
chose to have the conference here in Massachusetts? Just
That,
kidding.
the gentleman over there in the back set that all up. I think he did shoot me an email and ask me, what's up with Massachusetts? It's like, not until April. He goes, not a problem. One thing to keep in mind, PHMSA did already look at this. The DOT already did look at this. And so we need to preempt some of this problem. And in 2009, they published a letter, and it's on their website. It says, you know what? You guys can do everything that you want, but you cannot preempt the federal law. State cannot trump and take away from the intended safety of this. Same thing in 2012, PHMSA addressed, along with the DOT addressed basically recreational use. When we've seen Colorado, and I believe Washington State was one of the ones. Any questions so far? Okay. So going over some findings, I'm going to go pretty quick through some of these. I honestly don't think I did that. Oh, our picture looks better than this. I said Colorado. They put Pikes Peak on there, it looks like. So while we're waiting to get this up, some of the potential findings that are out there, I mean, I get a lot of questions from operators and they'll say, I just got audited. They didn't find anything. And we'll run the checklist, or they'll run an internal checklist for themselves and call us for, with some consulting. And how did they not find this? And I'll always say, well, I've ran a couple red lights and I do have a heavy foot, which I've been meaning to put on my expense report, boss. But just because you haven't been, a regulator hasn't found something doesn't necessarily mean that you're not meeting the requirement.
Yeah, I would say we always scrutinize ourselves when we're doing internal audits, more so than I find the Public Service Commission does. So we had an internal audit in advance of a Public Service Commission audit, and based on the internal audit, we were like, we're cooked, we are going to get in so much trouble, we found so many issues, but the Public Service Commission audit wasn't as bad. But that doesn't mean you ignore the issues you found, right? One thing that from an internal investigation and finding that could affect really others is how we treat call center individuals. So we had originally identified customer ops employees fielding call center calls as not part of a drug and alcohol pool. But what we found as it pertains to leak calls, when a member of the public calls, that's the first filter. And a section within customer operations in the call center asks a series of questions about the person calling about the leak. Well, guess what? They're performing a covered function because they're asking certain questions and based on the answer, routing the call. So that was an enhancement we had to make to our program, including those individuals into a drug and alcohol pool where they weren't before. And so then the next thing happened, well, these people are in their positions. Currently, we never did a pre-employment.
Right.
So the lawyers got involved with that. But that's internal auditing and investigating, finding something that not necessarily the commission or PHMSA would find.
Right. And it shows, prudency of the operator too as well. Right. We cannot go back and rewind the days and fix it. But what you can do is document it, right, and create a course of action to mitigate that from occurring in the future. Yeah. This is the one we talked about a little bit earlier, and Lauren addressed really well as far as what they were doing within Con Edison as far as the 60-minute training requirements, or actually 2-hour training requirements is what it is, 1 hour for alcohol, 1 hour for drugs. Did not have somebody at the site. I've seen this. You have to look at the demographics of your area you work in and how your company is set up, but I'll give you an example out at West Texas. You may have some operators out there may have an employee that don't see anybody for a couple days. They're out in the middle of absolutely nowhere. How do you answer this?
All right. Yeah. Right. And in those cases, I would highly recommend then the folks that are doing your quality inspections, quality checks, even when we heard about construction inspectors, if those people are one of the only levels of management that are doing observations in the field, then they probably should be considered for reasonable suspicion training.
Good. All right. One other one, procedures found inadequate. This was something as simple as a definition. The definition of accident wasn't in there, and they wrote the operator up for that. Civil penalty, $40,000 for a violation under 225.1, basically failing to test, that section of the code is the testing requirements, and they failed to test each covered employee that they could not discount.
Right.
Right. Some other common findings that, we try to talk to a lot of different regulators, and we also do quite a bit of assessments for operators, as well as contractors too as well. But here's some of the highlights that we found. Annual testing percentages not met. Lauren had a really good point. If you're finding this out March 15th of that year, which is your DAMIS reporting, it's too late. You need to be monitoring your program throughout the year. Flooding the pool. I believe, Lauren, you talked a little bit about that. Right. Flooding the pool, mixing non-DOT with DOT. I've seen a lot of companies, especially now, are like, we want to go above and beyond. It's all fine and dandy, but you got to be careful about what you're going above and beyond. By flooding the pool, one way, like, well, what does that take away from it? Well, you're in a sense taking away from those people that are required to be in there. You've got to, I don't do math in public, so You got 100 employees, well, I can do 25 out of that one. You got 100 employees, and only 10 are required to be in the pool. Those 10 may never get pulled.
Right.
It may be, dentist, desk worker guy that gets pulled that really doesn't need to be on the DOT pool.
Yeah, and I would suggest if you or the people responsible for this program haven't taken a look at your pool in a long time, it's worth a look, because you also get over time flooding happens, and it wasn't from the onset and establishment of the pool, but it's changing of the guard, different people in HR, different people in organizations. They say, oh yeah, that sounds like that should be in it. That sounds like that should be in it. And all of a sudden you've got clerks and call center reps that shouldn't be in the pool. So it's worth every so often kind of doing a check there.
Yep. Yes, sir.
On the last slide, it said plan does not meet minimum requirements, and I don't manage the drug and alcohol plan for my company, but I do deal with our contractors. And are the requirements the same for an operator and a contractor, or are the requirements different for an operator and a contractor?
The same.
Okay, so everything that the operator plan covers, the contractor should present a plan equal to the operator plan.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's the operator's responsibility to make sure a contractor plan meets those minimum requirements.
Good question. One of the other highlights, not to kill you too much with death by PowerPoint on here, and again, these will be available to you if you want to look at them a little bit later. The rehabilitation process and procedures are not being followed. These are what they're talking about, or what we've seen on this is just firing an employee because they failed the DOT test. You still have to provide proof that you have given them the SAP list, whether it's an email, however that is that you can provide document. Robert touched on it this morning and says, oh, that is wonderful. You're doing all of that? Show me. If you don't have the documentation, did it ever happen? Nope. Okay. And not all regulators are like Robert, where he said, or how Robert used to be, where I believe he used the word, I believe you, you just have to show me, right? I don't believe me, make me believe you. Show me your documentation. It's one thing to have a written plan. You can have the best written plan in the world, but is it effective if it's treated as a laissez-faire program, meaning nobody's overseeing it? You could have somebody with a doctor's degree in English write that plan and regulatory background for the past 30 years, but is that plan and program effective if it's not being run properly and or not communicated to your employees? Such was the case, one would argue, with Exxon Valdez. Everybody remember that incident that occurred? One of the things that's not too well known in that was the captain of the ship basically had an alcohol problem that the company should have known about. I believe they said that in their little report. Well, while he was not intoxicated during the time of the incident, or accident rather, the company should have known that he had a drinking problem. One of the last pieces that Lauren and I would like to share with you, or maybe even answer some of your questions, is the drug and alcohol and OQ. The two worlds come together. It's kind of like co-requisites. You can't do OQ without drug and alcohol. You can have drug and alcohol all day, meeting that requirement without the need for OQ, but you can't do it the other way around. And we talked a little bit about connecting those requirements a little bit earlier. As far as the definitions between a covered function and a covered task. You can guarantee that anybody with a covered task has to be on there, but not anybody working on your facility, if they don't have a covered task, they still may need to be required to be on the program.
This is the hardest thing for people who aren't in a drug and alcohol, who are not kind of managing drug and alcohol programs, to understand. When you talk to folks in gas operations, even contractors, the confusion between OpQual and drug and alcohol is alive and well. I've even heard people say, well, they don't need to be OpQual, they don't need to be in a drug and alcohol pool because they're not working on live gas, because we happen to shut the valve before they did the repair. I'm like, well, you're not going to do a repair on blowing gas, right. But that is certainly a covered function, and it definitely is a covered task. So you get like lots and lots of confusion. The best way to eliminate that confusion is through communication and training. One of the things we're doing after some of the findings we said was the little campaign of going out and talking to those in management positions, especially when they're generating contracts, to be aware of the differences, be aware of the requirements. So when you go out to get a contractor or when you're creating a new group within gas operations, you need to be aware of these things and ask the right questions ahead of time. We don't want to catch stuff after the fact. We want to get it in the right sequence of events.
Yeah. Good point. One of the last things that we're going to go over is the new NPRM to Part 40 that's coming out later on this year, or is expected to come out and be published as a final rule later on this year. Basically what they're doing is they're adding drugs to the actual list. And the whole reason for that is to revise the drug testing pool, basically they like using the word called harmonize the programs together. There is a problem with some of the drugs that are out there from their stats that they've seen, and I think this will, in a sense, not necessarily fix the problem, but add a layer of visible and mitigation to it for your safety program. A lot of the questions that we get in there is, we got this NPRM that's out, do I need to make changes to my plan now? No. Wait, don't make any changes to any of your programs until it actually becomes published as final rule. Even this last question, this one was actually asked to the government, can I go ahead and start testing my employees on this pool? As a company, we already do a 15 panel. This is nothing for us. We just throw our DOT folks and make them required underneath these new drugs. The answer the government gave was no. DOT testing must continue as it is until it becomes final rule. So I expect that to come out sometime in November, potentially. All right. Yes, sir.
Does that say you can't test for more?
Nope, cannot.
Okay, so you only have to stick to the 5.
Yes.
This is one of those goals where if you're more stringent, it hurts you.
Not necessarily that it hurts you. You could potentially be against the regulation, yes.
Gotcha.
Yep. Good question. Any other questions? Comments, concerns? I'm pleased to be able to let you know that we are going to take a quick break now. So I believe, how much time will we have? 10 minutes? So 10-minute break. And I'd like to thank you guys for your time. And Lauren, thank you so much for helping out.
Thank you.